So what are you really afraid of? Now, I can't tell you precisely what it is, but I can tell you the shape of it. And what it essentially is this fear of annihilation and this fear of abandonment if you happen to change. Now, a human being is a constantly evolving system. It is someone that learns and grows and changes and goes through all these eras and epochs in their very own life, comes to realizations, has epiphanies, makes changes. Fundamental things are abandoned and retrieved and picked up, and it's a necessary process. But the human being, the person, is always in relation to everybody else, and there is a degree to which the admiration and the attention and the value that you give to other people is based upon you sort of frozen at a certain point in your life, sort of frozen in a certain architecture of usefulness and just what you can actually do for everybody. Now, you can see how this sort of changes and makes worse a lot of relationships if it's not done correctly. So, in the parent-child, it's always like, unless you stay, who your parents know, you fear abandonment there. And it's really tricky because if your moral instruction is very capricious growing up, if you're given a lot of mixed signals, eventually you're not really given moral instruction. You're just more changing yourself or contorting yourself to match the current mood of the situation. So a lot of times a family can sort of become a container which you have to sort of contort to fit. And it is the same thing with intimate relationships. And, obviously that's where a lot of the abandonment fear comes from. That's where a lot of the attachment wounds are, is where you think that, if I change, the person abandons me. And not only that, but you begin to think, well, there's something, maybe it's just a false self that I've put forth. And then once the real self is discovered, then I'll be abandoned. It's all perfectly entwined. And, it's the same thing with social relationships and commercial relationships. Just this idea of like the imposter syndrome or, all of these sort of fears of worthlessness and lack of utility, and it just goes on and on. I mean, it goes to the divine as well, just like your feelings of inadequacy before whatever moral system is sort of imposed by the universe on you, whatever sort of inkling you have, whatever kind of guilt you have. And a lot of the layers just sort of contaminate one another. So as I've said before, like your feeling of guilt and shame with the divine is often based upon childhood and sort of vice versa. And it all just bleeds into all the other relationships. And that's why I can't separate them. And so there is in this fear of annihilation and abandonment, this is why people can't move on personally, politically, relationship-wise. This is why there is often these sort of constant counterproductive conflicts, because there are productive conflicts, but productive conflicts and productive negotiation really have to be naked, and they can't be with pretense, and they can't be with defenses and misdirections and lies that are not necessarily malicious or fraudulent, but it's just people trying to protect the very thing that made them useful and lovable in the first place. And if we can't talk, we don't know what the real problems are. And if we have to maintain these fixed roles, well, we can't really change anything. We can't go back on something. We can't sort of like flow into this continuum of ourselves in relation to the world. And so if you've built a career, for instance, on a certain political structure, a certain political opinion, well, good luck going back on that if it turns out to be the wrong thing. If you have this certain idea of relationships, well, you're never really going to find a safe one. I mean, when we're trying to think about like what is the antidote to all of these sort of fears of abandonment and fear of annihilation, well, what it would be is there are sort of very high temperature, high charge relationships. So that is sort of like, within families, the sort of the parent-child relationship, where there's obviously like an incredible bond and a lot of history, and it's a very, very significant relationship just based upon that. Then we go to the romantic, and it's this whole spectrum of like the erotic charge and love and just the cascade of just deeply, deeply evolutionary structures and hormones and everything going there. And then we think about like livelihood and just your social standing, where again, like your psyche deep down, because of sort of the evolution of us as tribes, does think of social abandonment as a painful experience. Like it literally like activates pain circuits, and it literally feels like you're going to die if you're rejected socially. So we have a lot of relationships that are based on these high temperature, high charge, high valence, and they're incredibly powerful. But the problem is that if all of your relationships are based upon these high charge things, then you're always in sort of a high arousal state where you're always just working with this tremendous performance anxiety that you have to remain this certain person. You have to remain the same person. And you would think, okay, well, we can abandon all those high charge relationships and, just I am a rock, I am an island, right? Well, that's annihilating too, because those things are what makes you a goddamn human. That is the thing that makes it worth getting up in the morning for. That is the beauty of life is found in those things. And the flame of that is what ignites everything about you. It's what makes life worth living at all. So you can't abandon them. And in fact, one of the most sort of tragic abandonment wounds and the attachment wounds is when you just decide nothing. I will be nothing. I will be a monk like ascetic, and I can't be hurt if I don't put my toe in the water. And so we can't abandon those things, but we have to deal with them. And then we think, okay, so in every relationship, that charge does tend to go away after a while, or it tends to morph, or it tends to change, or it becomes less of the emphasis. Because the thing with really high temperature things is that they have something of a short half-life, and they can be exhausting in and of themselves. So we think when we strip away the erotic charge, the familial charge, this social charge, what do we really have left? And that is sort of these low temperature, slow burn relationships. Now, these are sort of like your platonic relationships. These are your relationships of the same sex that are not based upon, commerce and finding jobs and connections and networking. And then, with children, it would tend to be more it's sort of like that Hippocratic oath that I spoke of before, where it's just like you have to abandon your expectations of your kids and just remember that, well, at a certain point, they become true sovereign people that you can't control, and you can't control directly, but you also can't sort of exercise this soft power of guilt and expectation. And the way to maintain these low temperature relationships is to have non-transactional relationships with people. So that is to say that you have friends that you're not really getting anything out of in the immediate sense. You're not like you just speak to them and commiserate with them for no purpose other than to just talk life, shoot the shit, gain some wisdom from them. But it's not like it's not an immediate reward that you get from it. It is sort of a slow burn relationship. And these ones are very important because when I think about, I used to debate anonymously on the internet, which is one of the greatest uses of the internet because it is a way for us to exchange ideas without there being any fear of reputational derangement, no fear of being judged, of being called out on something. And you learn so much truth and so much philosophy and so much of this sort of common human experience when you strip away all the charge. And truly, one of the reasons that I just love ideas and the intellect as such is all of these experiences and just like this long process of just having the very deep philosophical conversations with people, for which there was no charge. It was literally just the ideas themselves that we were all there for. And it is very important to have conversations where you're sort of stripped of this charge and stripped of identity. You're stripped of your ego and the superego, and you're just people. And you think about it too with like children. It's just like interacting with them on a basis where you're like there's no expectation there. And I think with kids we do this kind of awful, insidious thing where I remember when I was a kid, like adults would always open up with how's school going? Like, what are you doing in school? What are you learning in school? And it used to drive me up the wall in sort of this pre-verbal way that I understand now. It's just like, I'm not my role. I don't like school. Don't ask me what I'm doing in school. And I keep that going now, where it's just like, I'm really curious about what's going on in a child's world, like how they're actually, how they're perceiving the world and what it actually looks like to them. And, because I can remember, like, when I was in, say, 5th grade or something like that. I mean, there was this moment where I had a teacher that sort of reminds me of, like, Richard Feynman, actually, like, sort of very, like, animated, sort of passionate person. And there was a field trip where I think I forgot to hand in the form or get it signed or something. So it was just, like, 5 kids, and he was the one that was supervising, like, both the 5th grade classes. And in that, he just started rambling about his life. And I think that at one point, somebody in my class, and this little life raft of kids left, started talking about like how like their parents were hippies or they didn't like hippies or something like that. And this guy to a bunch of 10-year-olds is just like, well, no, I mean, hippies were very important. Like, they're the thing that's responsible for ending the Vietnam War. And I remember that moment. It's like, oh my God, like, this is the first time that somebody's actually, at least in this environment, is speaking to me with any kind of reverence for the fact that although I can't grasp it fully, I can at least understand something of the rudiment of what he's actually talking about. And then I think, God, this was ages ago, but I was walking to work once, and I see this kid, like, he's just like standing on the sidewalk, and then as I get closer, I realize that there's a daddy long legs, like, just sort of walking around, and he's like looking at it with, I don't know, it seems like a bit of fear. And I just ask him, it's like, are you scared of the spider? And he nods at me. And I said, oh, well, here, let me. And then I pick it up and I put it in my hand. And I said, yeah, they're not actually spiders, I don't think. They're actually more like a mosquito that doesn't even have a, I forget, I don't know if I call it a sting or like a proboscis or something, but like, it's a mosquito that can't even bite you. See, it's totally harmless. And I just like let it walk around my hands. And then I just left. And, I'll never see that kid again. But I mean, here's just this moment where I can just, do him a favor and just show him, yeah, no, it's entirely harmless. Like, I remember I had something akin to the Daddy Longlegs speech a while ago. When I was like 5 years old, my mother, she found like a honeybee in the garden, and it was really cold that night before, so it was like very sluggish. And so she just like put it in a jar lid or something. And I should mention that I was like mortally afraid of honeybees at this point. And she just shows it to me in a jar. It's just like, they get really sluggish when it's cold, but, maybe you'll be less scared of it if you see it up close. Now, didn't do anything. And I mean, a honeybee is still a little bit more dangerous, but it's just that this is the idea. It's just like, you cultivate all these relationships where you're not really getting anything immediate out of them. And so I'll think like, I have older friends that, they're in totally different industries, or they're retired or something. And I'm just like, I just meet them for coffee and just, like, tell me your wisdom, tell me about life. I give them sort of my issues and my perspectives. And I'm just like, I want this refracted through your extra 20 to 50 years of experience. Like, I'm dying to know, what my subjective experience does when it's filtered through somebody else's mind. And to have friends where, it's not just, I need somebody to help me move, or I need somebody to help me fix my car, or like just two people meeting and talking. And with platonic relationships, well, so I worked with a lot of women just because of the industry that I was in for a while. And one of the most instructive things about them was just like this idea of motherhood. Like, there's a lot of sort of counter signal propaganda out there about how like kids just ruin your life and they destroy everything and you're going to regret it, yada, yada, yada. And one of the greatest antidotes to that was just speaking to these women who, like high educational attainment, very depthy people. They paid attention to their own emotions. Like, there was like a lot of like sort of, meditation and mindfulness and everything. This is sort of the natural health world, so it's a complete occupational necessity. And the way that they would talk about their children, like they would here was a an adult woman with a university education being concerned with the emotions of a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old, and it was really like this lived kind of this communication to me that well, actually, maybe children's interiority actually necessitates this amount of adult intelligence. And, just the way that they had no reason to sort of virtue signal or communicate this to me, but just to be hearing about them actually worried about their children's mental state. And, fathers, I think they do the same sort of thing. In my experience with my friends, they will talk about it. It seems to be more of a retrospective approach where they seem to regret things after the fact. Maybe I could have been there for them a bit more. Maybe I, emphasized the other child a bit more to the detriment of the other. But they still think about it. But I just found it was more retroactive. Now that's as with all the gender war shit. I would just say that this obviously speaks to sort of a complementary necessity of mother and father. It's just the way that a man has to operate in the world. It seems to require some kind of blinders. It seems to require some kind of compartmentalization, which is precisely where you need sort of that emotional awareness to back it up. But nevertheless, again, non-transactional relationships. I mean, if we talk about like the flow of ideas here, like, one of my best friends, I mean, in speaking to him, like I would just ask him just like, because they've been through a lot and things are complicated and all that. And I just asked him just like, all right, like you can always deny the answer that you gave me, like this will just disappear. But like, do you actually love your wife? Like really, like, do you really? And he says, yes. And, I know I wouldn't have believed it and she wouldn't have believed it. And I know why you wouldn't believe it. That's just sort of the way that the world is now. But yeah, I do. And he answers me with complete honesty because there is no agenda there. If he ends up getting divorced, if he goes back and everything, we have the kind of relationship where we can't really hold either against one another if we change something about ourselves. And when we're talking about identity, well, what is the identity that you're really preserving here? Because identity has all these different features. There's sort of like, there's obviously the aesthetic, and there's like the superficial, and there is like the deep and moral. And when we're talking about, yes, people are going to change, but we have to reconcile the fact that you still have admiration for something. You're still in love with something. Like the reason that you dedicate yourself to other people in these sort of high temperature relationships, there is something beneath that. And the first thing that I would say is just like, if everyone is sort of scared of abandonment, well, what they're really scared of, I think, is they're scared of when the charge and these high temperature relationships, once that strong charge sort of goes away, it's no longer as intense, or if it changes into something else, that's when they're afraid they're going to get abandoned. So there's this constant performance anxiety where you're trying to maintain you as that person that attracted the high charge of somebody else. So if we want to talk about sort of relationships, like the fear around long-term relationships and marriage, well, that is because you're concerned, all right, well, eventually they're going to get bored of who I am. And so not only do I have to maintain who I am, but I have to make more precise and more concentrated this who I amness, this identity, so that I can always maintain this sort of like high erotic charge forever. And it's the same in social circumstances. It's the same in families, where it's just like, in order to not be abandoned, I have to be constantly performing. I have to be doing the right thing. I have to be doing the lovable thing. I have to be doing the socially beneficial thing. I have to be doing the most commercially viable thing, because if I don't, I'll be abandoned. If I'm not making enough money, I'll lose my relationship. If I'm not performing correctly, and it just goes onwards and onwards and onwards like that. But again, there's still something that people fall in love with. There's still something that keeps these bonds together. And it's I think it all comes down to the sort of moral topography of morality and ethics, which is the entire thing that I'm talking about always. It's just like, what is the strongest and most bedrock and most true and most ontologically consistent with reality and human nature, morality and value and worth at the bottom of it all. And that is where these ethics come in. These sort of like this non-aggression principle, this only owning the third thing between people, not overwriting, not being tyrannical, and having very precise definitions, both psychiatrically and practically, about what this overwriting is. But it is also just, we need to go a bit deeper when we have to acknowledge everyone's humanity, and we have to develop sort of this, our desires need to be based upon both the high charge, but also the slow burn things, the things that can only occur over time, the things that can only become more treasured over time. It's sort of like this, hardwood and softwood. Softwood grows very quickly and it's quite impressive, but it's weak, whereas hardwood is a very long process and it's a very, very slow growth. And that is sort of the best analogy for this. So if we think about, an intimate relationship, well, yes, the erotic charge will change over time, but it's more that the bond becomes more intense in the sort of slow burn human things, and sort of like the mind of the other person, and sort of like their thoughts and their personality, and in terms of matching their change, because that is one of the most terrifying things, is because no matter what, you're going to be a different person in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And if you're married, well, how do you avoid that sort of performance anxiety within it? And that is just that both people are ultimately anchored to these ethical and human condition based bonds. And, the way that you practice this is that you do have a lot of non-transaction relationships. Like, how do you actually approach your partner or your friends as human beings rather than instruments? As human beings that change and morph over time and are not instruments, how do you approach them as that? And that is precisely it. You have to practice, which means you have to be charitable. Like, you have to engage in relationships and efforts that are not immediately beneficial to you. If you think about it like this sort of atheistic defense of church, well, God doesn't pay you to go to church. The reason that you go to church is just to contemplate. And it's sort of this quiet, non-performative thing where, like, you go in there and everyone is equal, sort of under the eyes of God or whomever. And you're just there to stop and think about these sort of very deep things, these very sort of existential things. And it's a way to just take a rest and to remind yourself what it's all about, and even in a lot of Christian traditions, this Sabbath and Shabbos and all this, like this day of rest, that is to remind you that, like, yes, I mean, even in traditions like Germanic Protestantism, where it's just like you sort of like pay back the glory of God, or like you dedicate yourself by your work. But even in religion that sort of has that as a very strong tenet, there is still this day of rest because work is not everything. Like, it is to remind you that it's always going to be in service of some deeper, more divine connection. And there are people that are often forgotten. Like, I think about this idea about, the reason that you revere the elderly is because, who is the least instrumental? Because, age is the enemy of beauty, and age is the enemy of youth. You begin to, like, you can't work as hard when you're 80. You know what I mean? Like, you're not turning heads when you're 90. And it's just to not forget these people. And the reason that you don't, and the reason that you still, care for them and treasure them and ask for their perspective and wisdom is because that is you having a respect for this humanity that is underneath the immediately sort of beneficial and like the immediately superficially drawing, because we are in this sort of constant tug of war between the animal nature and the higher nature and the higher consciousness, and it's just, and people that are downtrodden, like that is my secular defense of charity and why I engage in it, because it's just like, you're only human if you're actually helping people that have nothing to give back to you. It's a sense of empathy in the sense of, like, you're always hoping that there is somebody that would do that for you. And if you want that to happen, if you want to be valued and loved despite not offering anything to anybody, Well, you have to become the world in which you have to support the world in which that actually happens. That's the whole point of charity. That's the whole point of sort of stopping and paying deeper attention to people that aren't as flashy or aren't as instrumentalized. And you can't escape it and you shouldn't escape it, because this is the answer to the fear underneath the fear of abandonment and annihilation. This is the answer. You have to engage with humans, not instruments. And if we're talking about people changing and, how do you maintain love across changes? Well, it's just this sort of moral topography that no matter what happens aesthetically, no matter what happens visually, or it doesn't matter like what career you've taken and like sort of what hobbies you have and just all of this random stuff. It's just like, as long as you're always centered towards like truth and beauty and the inherent value of people, it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as you stick to that, as long as you act with honesty and humility and grace towards everybody, then no good person will abandon you. If you are moral and if you're ethical in a way that just is the most sort of precise and all-encompassing. And that is why like morality and moral instruction and just all of these lectures and conversations about ethics and what it's all about, this is why it's so important, because the world doesn't move on politically. It doesn't move on relationally. It just does not move on towards what we could be unless we're actually having discussions and debates and coming to understanding with honesty about like what the hell is actually underneath all of this. I've been thinking about this concept of love as an involuntary response to virtue for a long time. And to the traditional virtues that I would sort of add as these things that allow you to recognize other people and sort of the void, curiosity. Just if you want to know people and you want to know humanity and you want to know yourself, it is just a matter of being deeply curious about everyone. And even in sort of the unlikely places, just asking people about their lives and their motivations and what causes them to rise each day and what do they think of as they fall asleep. Just all of these kind of things, and to sort of just be as equally open to answer their line of inquiry if they actually receive the question properly. But that is the thing. It's just like we only know ourselves through others, and that is why I emphasize this curiosity so much, even if the truths are hard to look at, even if the truths are revealing, even if the truths cause a lot of upheaval and change, because, if you are a moral person, you are sort of inoculated against the fear of change and the change that is necessary to just advance this experiment as we just twist and orbit through the universe, to just make sure that we're making something better of ourselves. And back in March, I wrote an article on negotiation, and I opened it with a line from Proverbs, which goes, "As water reflects a face, so the heart of one reflects another." And this is to say that it can if we let it.